So welcome everybody to this fall session of the Graduate and Faculty Christian Forum with Tom McLeish. We're excited to have him. He fits in well with our whole project of building an interface between faith and academics, faith and culture. And we've been running these forums for some 30 years and continue to enjoy speakers from around the world who have very interesting and creative things to say. So we also enjoy some sponsorship from the UBC Murren Fund and the Canadian Science and Christian Affiliation. If you want to check out more information, you can check our website, ubcgfcf.com. At any rate, Judy Taranchuk is just going to say a little bit about the Canadian Science and Christian Affiliation, and then we'll introduce Tom and let him get started. He says he has far too much material to share, but we'll have a creative time together with someone who I would have to say is one of the most creative and fertile minds of our day. So, Judy, would you like to say a little bit about CSCA?
Yeah, thank you. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I've not only been involved with GFCF since its inception for 30 years, but also with the CSCA for a bit longer than that. It shows you how old I am, but anyway, CSCA is a network of research scientists, professors, teachers, and others interested in the interaction of science and Christian faith. And we have 11 chapters across Canada, which provide venues for learning, discussion, and interaction with the broader faith and educational communities around important issues of science and faith. And so therefore, we sponsor lectures like this one. Numerous UBC faculty and students over the years have been members of the Vancouver chapter. And we also have members at Trinity Western and Region and the community at large. CSCA is an affiliate organization of the 75-year-old American Scientific Affiliation. And together with the American Scientific Affiliation, we publish quarterly the peer-reviewed journals, Perspectives in Science and Christian Faith, and a newsletter, and an interesting magazine, online magazine called God and Nature, which is done by Ard and his wife. Ard was one of our speakers last year. Yeah, so you can check out our website at csca.ca.
Thank you, Judy. I appreciate that. And so now let's get to the main event of the day with Tom McLeish. He's professor of natural philosophy and physics at the University of York. He's actually speaking from Oxford today. He's visiting there. And we look forward to his talk on his most recent book, The Poetry and Music of Science. And sorry, I don't have a slide, but there's the book. And but I just ask everybody, except for Tom, of course, to mute their microphones so that we have clear sound and good technical. So over to you, Tom.
Great. I'm going to share a little slide, and let's get going. I have this little presentation for you, and Gordon, worry not, because I do have a slide of the book. So sorry about that.
Very good. Yeah.
Can everyone hear me okay? Just want to make sure that good. Yeah, is that okay? Okay, right. So we're going to get going straight away on the story. Alexandra Carr provided this lovely front image, actually, which is a photograph of a three-dimensional installation she made. She's the artist in residence in our medieval science project. Might have mentioned her before when I was with you before, which is a model of the spheres. So creativity, and I want to tell you why I've got so interested in creativity. I should say that the book wears its theology quite lightly. It's a secular book for a secular audience, but of course you can't. I discovered that you can't talk about creativity in human beings in any type without thinking about the image of God. And so there are strong theological undertones. And for this talk, because of this company, I'm going to wallow in the luxury of bringing the theology from implicit to explicit, if I may. Is that all right? Let me just give you a couple of examples of little moments that we sometimes forget, but and they're not as uncommon as they might be. Leo Szilard, the theoretical physicist, had this extraordinary experience of what he was doing when he realized that it was possible, nuclear fission was possible. He was in London. He was actually crossing the road, stepping off a curb. This is a curb into the road. This is his biographer writing. As he crossed the street, time cracked open before him. He saw a way to the future, death to the world, all our woes, a shape of things to come. I mean, it's a very poetic way of writing these things. I thought I'd just listen to some other voices from the past to get us going. Ada Lovelace worked with Charles Babbage, of course, and a mathematician and a poet herself. Those who've learned, she writes in her diaries, to walk on the threshold of unknown worlds by means of that are commonly termed par excellence the exact sciences, may then with the fair white wings of imagination hope to soar further into the unexplored amidst which we live. So I don't know about anyone, by the way, I can hear some pages turning. I wonder if whoever's got a book or something can just mute themselves, unless they've got a question. They've got to put that in the chat, of course. Thank you. I'm still hearing someone's not muted. Can everyone mute themselves? Because I'm a bit concerned. Okay. Anyway, imagination and science and mathematics. It's not often that we associate imagination and science. And another example of this extraordinary aha moment, these moments of clarity, yeah, when suddenly an idea almost fully formed comes into people's minds, is actually recorded in the biography of Anselm, St. Anselm, who wrote the Proslogion and logical proof of the existence of God, great 11th century thinker. Suddenly one night, between the night vigils, the grace of God illuminated Anselm's heart. The whole matter became clear to his mind, and a great joy and exultation filled his inmost being. And it turns out Anselm had a sort of vision in which he could see through the walls of the of his monastery. So musing, here are the muses on a plan. This is in the next sort of 35 minutes or so. See how far we get, but we'll stop when we okay, trouble is I'm talking about a book. You can talk about a book for longer than 30 minutes, but here we go. A few interdisciplinary motivations of going interdisciplinary around arts and sciences and talking about creativity. And their connection. I want to talk about a creation narrative that emerges from a project I ran talking with scientists and artists about their creativity. But I don't mean, I'll explain what I mean by a creation narrative. It's not Genesis chapter 1, by the way. I want to talk a bit about emotion and cognition, how thought and feeling work together in creativity. And then I want to talk briefly, summarize the structure of my findings that went into this book. Notably, I want to talk about the 3 creative modes. I want to try and suggest to you that there's a deep connection between experimental science and the story behind literary fiction, the novel. I want to talk a little bit about what's not in the first edition of the book, but will be in the new edition, on poetry and theories, give you a bit of a taste of what's coming around the corner. And if we've got time, a little bit on music and mathematics and the transcendence before we wind up. We'd better get going straight away. Motivations. Now, those of you remember the last time I was with you and talked about a book called Faith and Wisdom in Science, when my question there was, how can we think of a biblically based theology of science by reading wisdom literature and doing some theology? I came to my temporary conclusion, which is my working hypothesis, which is that science is a sort of toolbox of work of healing, one of the many broken relationships that Christians are asked to heal, which is that of humans with nature. And it somehow sits within the Pauline ministry of reconciliation. So here's one relationship in which academics find themselves, particularly scientists, in thinking anew, afresh about science, not as some sort of obstacle for faith at all, but as a gift of God in order to do a work within the kingdom. But there's other ministries of reconciliation that I think academics can think about themselves. And wherever we see brokenness, I think we're called as Christians to think about whether we can be ministers of healing. And one of the dimensions of brokenness we see is on our campuses. It's the classical brokenness between the disciplines. And I think one of the reasons that I'm a committed interdisciplinarian is, I think, comes from this motivation to heal division and to think of oneness or a single family. And of course, this is a biblical design pattern, you see. Look at Karl Barth, writing reconciliation becomes a title for one of his volumes in the church. Dogmatics just explore exile and the long leitmotif, the biblical theme of exile, and how necessary it is to reenact this biblical design pattern of dispersal, conflict, but reconciliation. When we're still under the shadow of books like John William Draper's pernicious polemic that has done so much damage to the church and beyond in inventing a conflict between science and faith. But it's happened before. It's happened before, you see. And of course, this particular fragmentation between the disciplines has its biggest divide, biggest crevasse, if you like, between the humanities and the sciences. So here's C.P. Snow's book following his Reith lectures, The Two Cultures. The two cultures have become a rather tawdry, but dull, tired, but still operative motif for this culture. And but he's not the first to talk about this. So John Keats wrote about scientists, he called them philosophers, those who unweave the rainbow. And Blake is the earliest attestation I've found, William Blake, in this piece, which comes from his writing on Milton. He will not reason and compare. He says, not like Bacon, Locke, and Newton, my business is to create. So Blake, I think, is the first person who began to imply that the scientists, the rationalists are not creative, that's the artist. And even now, I wince at, I don't know if you hear this in Canada, we sometimes have language of, I'm a creative, or the creative disciplines. And that never includes scientists or sciences. But, okay, so here's the bottom line, I'll jump to it straight away, just in case the penny hasn't dropped with anyone. Of course, science is profoundly creative. We cannot read our models, our reconstructions, our theories of the universe off of our observations of data. We can't deduce the existence of DNA or galaxies or black holes or anything. We have to induce it. In other words, we have to imagine it first, and then we check our imaginations. Okay, so science is a profoundly imaginative venture, and we've not been good at communicating that, and we could do better. So I've got my bee in my bonnet again, as we say, like I did with Faith and Wisdom in Science, and I wanted to explore and get scientists to talk at more volume about creativity. But the biggest reason of all is when I visited schools. I kept visiting high schools. I often visit schools. I enjoy it very much, and talk to pupils, perhaps in their latter years, about interdisciplinary topics. Maybe it's faith and science. That's a endless discussion. In high schools, it's great fun to do with them as well. And they all think there's a massive conflict. Sometimes it's art and science. And then the really bright ones, you come across bright kids. In Britain, maybe you don't have this problem in Canada. In Britain, we have this ridiculously specialist, over-specialized education system that when I was education chair at the Royal Society, I tried desperately to begin to move on from, where it's possible in our country for people to drop all sciences or all arts and humanities at the age of 16. And the really bright, I always ask kids, not by blaming them. Why don't you do science? And some of them say, "Oh, it's too difficult. I'm not good at it." So they wasn't my strong ones. But the really bright ones never say that. The bright ones who are engaging with my arguments, pushing back, thinking, bringing up other ideas. They say this. They say, "I didn't choose science because it isn't creative, or there's no room for my imagination," or something like that. And when this failure to communicate the role of creativity, imagination, science has gone to the school kids, I really get upset. So I had to write a book. So, it isn't as if people thought this was obvious. Wordsworth, writing in lyrical ballads, predicted the day when the remotest discoveries, the chemists, meteorologists, will be the proper objects of the poet's art, as upon any which it can be employed. But he makes it conditional. If time should come when these things, namely the scientific things of chemistry, botany, biology, mineralogy, shall be familiar to us. In other words, we can use them as metaphors in poetry, and the relations under which they're contemplated by the followers of these respective sciences shall be manifestly and palpably material to us as enjoying and suffering beings. Well, I'm sure many people suffer from the science. I don't think the same people would say they enjoy it, but in other words, we've not done what Wordsworth wanted us to do. And shortly after, less than 50 years after, Robert Hunt, in his forerunner of poetry, music, and science, poetry and science, said, the fumes of the laboratories, alkalis, acids, mechanical, specular lenses do not appear fitted as a place in the painted bowers of the muses. Well, why not? Wordsworth thought they would be. And of course, Poe, Edgar Allan Poe, science, true daughter of old time, thou art, who alterest all things with thy peering eyes. Why preyest thou thus upon the poet's art, vulture, whose wings are dull realities? I mean, this is not the science I know, but it's the science we communicate. We have to do better. Let's do better. Interesting that poetry and science become, some ways, that particular aspect of the science-humanities dialogue, a leitmotif, a metaphor for the dualisms that people like Richard Dawkins promote. Science, the only way to know and understand the real world. I don't know who's here might have read Mary Midgley. Mary Midgley, wonderful Newcastle northeastern philosopher, only recently died, bless her, in her extreme old age, still writing in her late 80s and 90s she was. Writes one of her main polemics against, well thought through polemics against Dawkins. She calls it science and poetry. Not many poems in the book, but she calls it science. So there are, in other words, this art and science divide becomes inexorably a theological thing when you touch on poetry, because the same people, the same new atheists who inveigh and against faith, against belief, against theism, will also promote this division too. Wonder why? And yet, when we ask the practitioners, we've already come across this quote from Ada Lovelace, who also said that if she wanted to, if she wanted to write some poetry, she found in her experience the best preparation for true inspiration of writing poetry was to spend a week doing mathematics. So she knew some of the connection. Some of you will know Richard Feynman was a very interesting physicist and Nobel Prize winner. He was challenged on this subject and used to say in response to artists, he said, you scientists just take all the glory and wonder out of the beauty that we artists try to reflect in nature. Say, I just don't believe you. I can appreciate the beauty of a flower, but when I think of a flower, perhaps not as refined a way as you do, but I think of its inner beauty, the cells of the structure, the proteins and the molecules inside, all the beauty of its evolution, the way that the bees see with ultraviolet light the colors of the flowers. All those things, science opens up and they have a beauty as well. It only adds. I don't see how it subtracts. Sooner or later, we'd be asking Einstein, won't we? So let's ask him now. Imagination is more important, says Einstein. He said it many times. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world. And he was right. He knew how to understand. Now, and it's true that some of the reactions to both art and science, when people are honest about them, are equally profound. I'm giving you quite some detailed text, but I love this little piece. Just let your eyes just run over Simon Russell Beale, the great Shakespearean actor, talking not about drama here, but about Schubert's late B-flat sonata. The result is a play of pure sound without external reference that gives us a glimpse of eternity. It's glorious writing. He's obviously been profoundly moved. Now just compare that text, this one I will read, by Subraham Chandrasekhar, the great mathematical cosmologist, writing about black holes, this shuddering before the beautiful, this incredible fact that a discovery motivated by a search after the beautiful in mathematics should find its exact replica in nature, persuades me to say that beauty is that to which the human mind responds at its most deepest and most profound. So here are two human beings responding emotionally to a sublime beauty which they find, one in music and one in mathematical physics. So here's the project. Here's a picture of the project. What I set out to do was to talk to artists and scientists of all kinds, not about their published results, but about their route to their results. What's their creative process, their story, including the wrong turns, the funny dreams, whatever it was, the hopes, the just whatever. And to as a control experiment, I also talked to artists. You see some artists here. You see composer Janet Graham, Alexandra Carr herself, and the image is here. Julie Cornfield, my longtime friend and polymer chemical engineer at Caltech. Tanya Liverpool, who's now a biophysicist. All these people. And I guess what I thought I was going to do is to write some nice chapters on accounts of my interviews, and also reading from past testimonies to this, of scientific creativity, and some nice chapters on artistic creativity, and then a nice final closing undergraduate essay chapter that would bridge between the two. That was the book plan. Didn't work out that way. You cannot write that book. And you can't write that book because it wouldn't be true. I found that there's no such thing as an artistic sort of creativity and a scientific sort of creativity. I found there were different modes of creativity, but they spilled over between all disciplines: poetry, literature, engineering, mathematics, music, chemistry. And I found people were telling me stories that fit into a common pattern. So let me, in 2 slides, summarize the whole book, and then we've done everything we need to do with the talk, and then everything else is sort of extras until we get to question time when I can stop. So the first commonality I found was that everyone was telling me, when I really got them to talk about their creative stories, and for scientists, it often takes a glass of beer or two before they realize, no, I don't want the summary of your paper, I want that real story, warts and all. They told me a very similar story, which is the story I've called a creation narrative. And of course, now you understand what it is. I don't mean a mythical story that is a story of the creation of the world. God's created creation. I'm talking about the story of human creativity, and that has a story too. And it goes something like this. I'm not saying that every person told me exactly this pattern, but this pattern emerges out of that collection. You have an initial vision of something you want to do, or create, or make a poem, a picture, a scientific problem, a theory, a computer device, a program. But of course, it's a blurred vision, because if it were precise, you'd already know what it was and you'd have it, but you have this vision. What this vision then does is to set up in you a desire to make it, to solve it, to do it. And people talked about this great desire. And I find when creating at the forefront of things, it's important we have these emotions, because otherwise we'd give up, they drive us. Then there's a series of attempts to get there. But typically, although the end goal is in sight, in some sort of blurred sight, the route to it isn't so clear. And whether it's in art or science or poetry or mathematics, different routes have to be tried. It's a lot of heavy lifting for the first time, hence a weightlifting guinea pig. And the experience of this is therefore constraints. We find problems, obstacles, and failure. And that can be very distressing. But after days, weeks, months, sometimes even years, sometimes never, but sometimes something wonderful happens. It's as if from the muse, as if from a vision, from an angel, from God. It's not something we feel consciously effortful in producing, but it comes from our subconscious. It's the aha moment. And again, not everyone has aha moments. Sometimes it's a period, but not everyone becomes a Christian in a sudden conversion event. Sometimes it's a process, but it's the same with these ideas. Something comes from our subconscious, and it's just a wonderful thing. Whether it's how to write the poem, how to write them, get the metaphors going, which color scheme to use in the painting, what coarse graining of the physics to do, whatever it is. And then there's this wonderful aesthetic, and you respond to this. There's still work to do, by the way, after this final stage, but it's there. So this is the story, what I've called the creation narrative. And if I had a 5 every time I've heard it, as they say, I'd be doing a different job or something. No, probably not. So here's a little example of that. I'm just going to exemplify this briefly. I'm working on protein dynamics sometimes. Here's a protein bound to DNA, and here's a computer simulation of it at room temperature. And I'm always fascinated by Brownian motion. I think I might have said to somebody before, my science is sort of motivated by the question, how does order arise from chaos? And here's I'm interested in how information transfer comes from across protein works in this noisy environment. And I remember having a sort of daydream when I was watching the figure on the left in a talk in a graduate lecture, and into my mind came its dynamic form. It became choreographed, as it were, in the right. And I started to think my way through to the question. And I very much wanted to solve it. It took a long time. But here's a much better mathematician than me, a real mathematician, Andrew Wiles, talking about his desire to solve Fermat's last theorem. I obsessed with it, he says, obsessed all the time. Went to sleep at night and woke up with it. And that went on for 8 years. It takes that sort of desire to solve a 3.5 century unsolved problem. And then these aha moments. Here's another theoretical physicist, and then some of you might know Michael Berry of the Berry phase, wonderful mathematical physicist. I love this story he tells. This is an example of this upwelling. I was on a train, he says, in January 1985 in Germany. It was so cold, there was ice inside the windows. I had some insight about the connection between quantum mechanics and chaos. I was working this out, and suddenly popped into my head that this is all relevant to the Riemann zeta function. Of course. And I remember the exact moment it happened. Of course, I was prepared because I'd read an article about it 8 years before, but I hadn't thought about it since. I don't know how it happened. It wasn't visual. Otherwise, on a cartoon, don't know why I did that. And I thought that's wonderful. Can you see how that moment is so memorable? Do you see how his memory is imprinted? What he could see at that moment. He sees the ice on the windows. He remembers that. It's stapled into his memory, this upwelling of subconscious to conscious. This story appears also in the past. Henry James, the novelist, wrote a book about the art of the novelist called The Art of the Novel. And it's a collection of his prefaces. He liked to write about his creative process. And one can pull out a structure from his writing. I won't go into these quotes, but just perhaps the stages of his experience of ideation. And then his hard work, he describes, as many novelists do, actually, of observation. They don't create their characters or manipulate them like puppet masters. They observe in their imaginations. But this leads a lot of incubation before one can write. And then something happens, an illumination, and then the final stage of verification. many of you will know about Henry James. Few, I guess, the scientist, the physiologist William Beveridge, who a generation later also wrote in this genre, the art of. He wrote an art of scientific investigation. He wrote about how scientists in history and how he and his colleagues also work, uses the same vocabulary as William James in the scientific process of ideation, constantly on the lookout, incubation of thinking about these ideas, illumination of this involuntary, not voluntary act of passive reception of an idea, and the verification constraint of form. And he writes about Darwin. So there's an example from history that reflects what I'm learning in the present. And you know, if you want to know the issue of thought and feeling, I mentioned Julie Cornfield. I was gobsmacked 3 years ago. I went to a talk, which is a regular talk she gave at a polymer physics course lecture, annual conference we have in the UK, which brings people from industry and academia together in an interesting way. And my jaw dropped because without asking her, Julie was talking about the story of a scientific project in the most honest way I have ever heard a scientist on a platform talk. It was sheer music and it was wonderful. And the project was an extraordinary polymer science and technology project to stop that happening. The project was to design a polymeric additive for jet fuel so that on any impact, it wouldn't explode. And this can be done. The trick is to stop it making droplets. And the reason that polymer additives might work is because a polymer acts like a little molecular spring, and for a large droplet to break into smaller ones, here's a large droplet, it's going to break into smaller, it has to extend first, and there's the radial stability, and then it pulls a little thread between the two droplets, and then they part. And it's the droplets with the small droplets with a large surface area that cause those explosions, 9/11 among them. There was a project in the 1970s to do this following that horrendous double jumbo jet crash on the island on Tenerife. But it foundered and funding was removed. So after 9/11, Julie's group had to do this on literally a wing and a prayer. I mean a wing and a prayer, because some of her group, she's of a Jewish background, she's not practicing. There were Christians and Jews in her group, practicing Jews, who were praying their way through this project and emotionally fueled to do it. I can't now, I didn't have time to recapitulate the story, but she'd do it much better than me anyway. But it was a beautiful testimony of how the detailed science that was reflected in diagrams and calculations like this, and sheer emotional roller coasters drive projects through the PhD desert and all that, but written much larger. And of course, they eventually did find a wonderful solution. It's a marvelous technical solution. Talk about that another day. And there's his from the paper in Science. And it turns out that this notion of emotion, I don't know if you notice one thing about that story I told, this general story of creativity, is that you can't disentangle the affective or emotional side of our minds, our creative minds, from the cognitive and logical and rational. The two dance around each other all the time. Turns out this has long been understood. We just don't talk about it in the postmodern world very much, because we have this insistent dualism that comes from Descartes and Locke and all sorts of people, and from the founders of the Royal Society, I'm afraid and embarrassed to say, that emotion has no room for rationality. I'm sorry, all human beings are human beings. The honest thinkers, the medieval philosophers, so Robert Grosseteste, my favorite medieval thinker, writes in his introduction to the book on the liberal arts, which is the medieval intellectual educational curriculum, this: the works in our capacity exist either in the mind's sight, that's cognition, or in the desire of the same, or in actually what we do in actions. He has three things: or in disposition of the motion. Sight first looks, then verifies what's been looked at or cognized or thought, and when the fitting or harmful have been verified within the mind or within sight, desire strains to embrace the fitting or retreats itself to shun the harmful. So For the medievalist, morality and emotion and cognition and action are all part of the same process. Hooray. Here's another quote. Yeah, I love this. Leo Izaki, Japanese Nobel Prize winner for electron tunneling. He's one of these few late modern scientists who are honest about this. Science too has its dual characteristics. It's dual, not a dualism, but a dual part, two parts. It has its logical, objective, cool, rational, of course, rigorous face. The other face, fantastic, subjective, individualistic, intuitive, lively, reflects the process by which the new is created. Inspiration, I'll jump forward. We grope forward in desperate struggle of trial and error, seeking out the secrets of the universe. If by chance they find a solution, efforts rewarded, they could be truly happy. This is the creative process, which is the essence of science. So he knew all about this. Right, so that's the story. In posh language, that's, I suppose, the diachronic pattern that emerged. I said I had one other way to summarize things, and this is the synchronic patterning, or the creative modes, which remember I said I thought there might have been a sort of humanities mode and a science mode. No, there are other modes which span everybody, and there may be more than three. I found three. I found it convenient. Others have written in other ways, and they are these. There's the visual in art and science. Of course, visual artists think and paint visually. Some scientists and mathematicians think visually, but not all. If you don't think in pictures, sometimes you think in words. There's the textual. Of course, poetry, novelistic writing, metaphor, that's all textual, and it's textual thinking. There's a deep and cousinly engagement between the textual and the history of scientific experiment, by the way, which I hope I'll get on to a little bit about before we finish, because it was a big surprise for me when my colleague at Durham, Pat Waugh, professor of history, of English rather, at Durham, and a Virginia Woolf scholar, said to me at the beginning of this project, so Tom, it's an interesting project. He said, you do know, don't you, that that it is no coincidence that the early English novel and experimental method are coincident, don't you? Better explore that one. And so what about the third mode? So surely once we have no pictures or no words, what else can we think of but there? At that point comes the transcendental worlds of music in art and mathematics that have no words, have no pictures. Sometimes they do, but may have no words and no pictures. And the extraordinary way in which there's infinite spaces of creativity, human creativity, which have no words or pictures, and are music, mathematics, and more, and ideas. So those are the three, and we'll see if we can have a quick gallop through those. Visual. Einstein thought visually, he told so. And I've been fascinated in the link between theoretical physics and some aspects of painting, particularly Impressionist painting. You know, let me just give you a taste for why that is. How you look at Impressionist painting, you know, you have to stand right back from it, see the whole scene, but you also, to appreciate the brushwork, you need to come really close. And those of you who do theoretical science, maybe and other things as well, will appreciate, I'm sure, the analogy. One has to spend half the time looking close at the details of the theory, the mathematics, but you've got to keep standing back and seeing the whole. And these two aspects of creative theoretical science seem to me to be intimately visual in a sort of perspective way. Anyway, Robert Gostes knew about this as well, by the way. I love this medieval science. Look at, he talks about this mind sight, this penetrating power of the mind's eye, which is imagining what is in the inner structure of nature. It doesn't rest on the outer surface of an object. It penetrates below the visual image. For instance, when the mind's eye falls on a colored surface, it descends the physical structure, which the color is in effect, then penetrates again to the elemental qualities. This was 1225, but it could be a description of what physics does and chemistry does and biology does today. But see how it's written in visual metaphor. Number two, we're galloping quickly. In case you don't believe me when I say that experimental science and fiction is deeply related, let's just return to Joseph Priestley, discoverer of oxygen, co-discoverer of oxygen. Well, fiction, he says, resemble those machines which we contrive to illustrate the principles of philosophy, natural philosophy, of course, he means science, globes or orreries. He said it in 1761 without explanation. In 1761, it was obvious, he thought, that works of fiction resembled experimental apparatuses. Iris Murdoch, let's think about a philosopher and a novelist. Let's see what she writes about novelistic writing. Enables an attention to the inexhaustible detail of the world, the endlessness of the task of understanding, and the apprehension of the unique. If you change novelistic writing to experimental science in that sentence, it makes perfect sense. You know what I mean? Arguably the first science fiction novel was Margaret Cavendish's Blazing World, one of my favorite philosophers, of early modern philosophers actually, who pointed out how ridiculous experimental science is. You do realize, don't you, that no one expects experiments to be a helpful route to learning anything about how the material world works. You don't? Well, no, they're obviously pointless because, look, we're just so used to the working. And people, we get all anachronistic about this. We blame the medievalists and the early Renaissance people for not having invented experiments. We shouldn't. They were much smarter than we were. Experiments should never work. Why? What's the world? The world is a complex, many-component, mixed, turbulent, completely interactive place. What's an experiment? Simple, 2-component, 3-component, isolated, artificial. How could we ever learn anything about the former from the latter? My friends, it's important that we trumpet the historical truth here, that the realization in Francis Bacon and others that experimental method would work was that it would work only by grace in a full Christian understanding of the fall and an understanding of the human mandate to learn about this natural world again. It was a Christian imaginative explosion that invented the experimental method against all odds. So enough, there we go. I'm going to just jump over this and we're going to do a little bit on poetry. So now this is not in the first volume of the book, but one of the reasons I've written a new edition come out next year, I don't want to put you off buying the first edition, and OUP being very slow, it might never come out, is that for a book called Poetry, Music and of Science, some of the critics said there's not much about poetry in here. And I had to say, guilty as charged, Trade's Descriptions Act, sorry about this. I didn't really write, because I didn't think that Wordsworth's prediction that poetry would be inspired by science had come true. And since 2019, I've found there's loads of stuff on science and poetry. Here's Malcolm Guite, Christian poet. I give some of you will read Malcolm's sonnets, ecclesiastical sonnets. He writes for every Christian season. Look at what he writes about the infleshed word and poetry here. How Ursula Gwynne, great novelist and poet, science describes from the outside, poetry describes actually from the inside. She sees this complementarity between science and poetry. Mary Midgley herself, writing in the book Science and Poetry, verbs that mind and body come out of the same underlying worldview, which also emerge both in poetry and science. So here's my device conjecture. If experimental science and prose writing go together, might not poetry and theoretical science mirror and image each other in the same way as Wordsworth, as we already, and it turns out that there's a lot more science writing going on now than I thought. Here are some anthologies and writers and poetry-inspired science and writing around it, and I could go on. There's even a new journal founded last year called Consilience by my friend at Manchester, Sam Illingworth. It's online, it's free, you can download it and look at it every quarter. It's an online free journal of science and poetry. It's brilliant. Rebecca Elson, fabulous astronomer and poet herself, just great poem. So I've had great fun exploring this new nexus between science and poetry, and Wordsworth has more to say, and Emerson has more to say, and people like, here's a poem. Mary Peelan writes about supernovas. Let's read it. A future sun will rise up in all its glory, so red and ravenous it devours the daytime sky, matter ripping itself into sound and light in one last explosion. It's uncontainable as art itself. Dying as an art, said Sylvia Plath, dark energy, providing the opposite of gravity. Heaven performs a billion spectacular finales. It's up to us to conjure the rest. We'd all start with divinity and work backwards if we could manage the math. But even Lady Lazarus burned her miraculous hair in the calculus of resurrection. It's not time to, I could unpack this poem, but this is the sort of quality of science-inspired poetry now, which pulls metaphor into conversation with scientific, connects to and from the scientific imagination, and evolves entirely new narratives. Why might poetry and science be sisters? Because of this. Art lives from constraints and dies from freedom, says Da Vinci. Stravinsky writes in music, the more constraints one imposes, the more one frees oneself of the chains that shackle the spirit. And what could involve the greater imagination than to reimagine the universe? And what could constitute the greater form or constraints than to make that imagination conform to the universe we see? Science and its process is like creating a poem of imagination constrained by form. That's how it works. And mathematics and music. Well, we've not got time. I'm going to rush on to the end. All I'm going to say is that mathematics and music do not dwell together because of quantity, but more because of what Julian Horton says about composers of the first rank, is their ability to set up strategic problems of harmony and to solve them within their artistic creation. That's what mathematicians do, because it's abstract. There's notation in both. Some people are going to go yuck to the notation on the left, and some people are going to go to the notation on the right, but both have their transcendent beauty because they represent things beyond us. What I'm going to do now is finish off. I've got 2 minutes left and I'm going to talk about what might be going on theologically. Here's Steiner in his amazingly theological book, Real Presences. I mentioned to some of you before, a wager on meaning and text and music, a wager on transcendence. That's where this is pointing us all. Here's Shakespeare talking of the poet's eye, the poet's role in some extreme, glancing heaven to earth and earth to heaven, and in imagination, giving by the poet's pen the forms of things unknown, gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. And I remember first reading this speech by Theseus in Midsummer Night's Dream, thinking, gosh, that's what science does. It gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. And naming things sounds very theological. And as Steiner also said, there is this job to do to make friends, to be reconciled with the sheer inhuman otherness of matter. And that feels like the ministry of reconciliation. And here's Philip Hefner talking about the theology of being in the image of God. And there's one aspect that strikes me, 2,000 years of discussion of what it means to be the image of God. But if it does mean, I mean, the first thing that the biblical God does is to create. And I think that's why Hefner calls the humans the created co-creators. And our creative impulse is maybe part of our being in the image of God. And that is why this creative aspect is so important. Maybe the way to understand the theology of science is in this sense that if humans are the image of the creator, then the image of the creator who creates the universe, we don't ourselves create a universe. That's for God to do. But we as God's image might create an image of the universe that helps us name it and steward it. That begins to sound a bit more like science, a wager on God. So at that point, I am going to just leave off and just finish with one quote from Malcolm Guite in his book Faith, Hope and Poetry, which is a book I'd thoroughly recommend. If part of the Imago Dei, image of God, is thus itself our creative imagination, then we should expect the action of the word indwelling and redeeming fallen humanity to begin in and work outward through the human imagination. If this is so, then we should be able to discern the presence of that work, capital W, in works of art, and I've added, with Malcolm's permission here, and science, which are the fruit of our imagination. And at that, I'll leave you with another image of the sales pitch and ask how this theological understanding of our creativity, our reconciliation, and our creativity within science and arts change our work, our ministry, and our mission. Thank you very much for allowing me to share all this personal stuff with you.
Thanks very much, Tom. Appreciate that a lot. At this time, we have a chance to ask Tom questions. I'll just start it off with, I remember reading in your book about the high point of interface between science and literature in the Romantics. And you mentioned a lot about Humboldt, which you haven't done in your talk. So I wondered if you could say, what was unique about that period, among the Romantics?
Yes, so I love
the interface between science and
right. Well, it was two-edged, the Romantic period, because from the same Romantic period comes Blake Early, then Keats and Poe, and the Romantic division of the sciences and the arts. In the Romantic period, scientists get to be called scientists rather than natural philosophers, and philosophy is hived off. As a humanity, everything falls asunder. But at the same time, you have another way, and I think Humboldt, and by the way, Goethe before him, I should also talk about Goethe, who himself had profound things to say about science and poetry. He said that he wrote that poetry and science have the same cradle, and they've gone their separate ways, but the future will come when they are reconciled again. And of course, Goethe received a lot of criticism for the way he did science, but he did science in a very holistic way. And Humboldt too, the way Humboldt wrote about science is quite extraordinary. I do actually, I think, have a little glimpseable from Humboldt, on if I can find. No, maybe I don't. Maybe I don't quite. No, I'm sorry. But his imaginative element came in the way he wrote science. So he was able to think both in terms of analysis and holism, and his prose in Ansicht and die Natur, for example, is just, he pointed a way to a writing about science that we in the Anglophone world deliberately desiccated with our passive voices and our pretense of the abstract observer. But Humboldt always understood the observer was embedded in the world that she observes, and of the metaphorical power of scientific language. So yeah, thank you, Gordon. Great. Jeffrey, I know, did write a question and as well, and now he's put his hand up, so we better let him ask the question.
Okay.
Yes, I'm very eager. So yeah, I'm a big fan of your work. So thanks for your writing. And I heard about you through Gilbert and his Science and the Truthfulness of Beauty.
Oh yeah, great.
So I have a question. Tomorrow we have this new holiday for truth and reconciliation in our country.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you think are some opportunities for a science that you're describing that's open to poetry and music and our image of God to dialogue with indigenous worldviews? It's clear to me with ecology and astronomy, because there's been experience with that, but when you're talking about technology and new realities that are quite novel to any culture, then how does that sort of interact?
Yeah, I think there's fascinating ways, and so I think one of the ways in which science has failed by over professionalizing itself. So I say more about this in the Boyle. I was very honoured to give asked to give the Boyle Lecture earlier this year. It's just come out in Zygon in printed form actually this week. If you really are serious about enjoying what I write, and what I wanted to lecture on this year is Robert Boyle's vision that science, where there be so just in a Reformation world, where the Bible reading was for everyone, not just for the priests. So science could be, in the same way, in a sort of reformed science for everyone. There'd be a lay science, not just a priesthood of professionals who could do all the observation and teaching and hermeneutics. We would too. And that sprung from, why was that? Because every human being needs to be reconciled to God. That's the reform derived to the Reformation, of course, and the heart of true Catholicism too, but never mind. But that's been lost. In a sense, I say the Counter-Reformation didn't really succeed in the church, but it did in science. And so the whole lay appreciation of contemplating the world. So I call this rediscovery contemplation through science. Now, indigenous people know how to do this. Now, we know from the Book of Job and the wisdom literature that actually the motivation for science is extremely ancient. There never was a time when poetry, art, human beings weren't representing in image form the creation, the material world they found about them, to try to understand it and to name it. Indigenous people are very good at this. Now, a way not to do it, of course, is to ask, well, how close did they get to our fancy modern understanding of science? No, the way to do it is to learn from what they do, our lost art of weaving back the emotional, the representative, the aesthetic into science, which is a holistic way in which it offers much higher valency for people at large to engage, find roots into a reconciliation with the world. So that would be the first off the top suggestion. Yeah, rainbow snakes if you're in Australia.
Great. One more question. One more question from the chat. Mike Solotnik asked, could you elaborate a little bit, Tom, on the power of the imagination within the constraints of form? This is a major point you make in your book.
What I mean by this, let me remind you of the English lesson I know we've all had when we were about 14 or 15, although many of us have forgotten it, about, the sonnet. So why do poets, when they fall in passionate love, write sonnets? And it's because if you're passionately in love and you pour it all out in words, what you get is a mess. No one likes a mess. Right? It's incoherent blabber. On the other hand, sonnets, such a tight form. If you don't have sufficient creative energy, don't try writing a sonnet. Write something easier. Right? I remember my English teacher telling us, you'll only ever write a sonnet when you fall passionately in love. I'm not sure how much I should tell you about my personal experience of this in future. My poems are only not for public consumption anyway, but it may or may not have been true. But it is true for real poets. Now, so there's something you see beautifully creative about the power of emotional creativity, and you need a really tight constraint, which is poetic form, to produce the final. You need both of those, if you like, an outward Big Bang energy and an inward constraint to create the perfect form. It happens in sculpture, it happens in all creativity is like this. It can, I think, be articulated as a creative opposition of imagination and form. Outward imagination, which without the form would be a mess. but it's formed by the constraints. The analogy is with science. You see, if we didn't have observation experiment, we'd just be writing down string theory. Apologies for the string theorists here, but you see, string theory is an example of an unconstrained splurge of stuff. And who knows? It's not beautiful. Why? Well, it's aesthetics, mathematics is aesthetically beautiful. It's not beautiful in a scientific sense because it hasn't met the inward constraint of experimental form. Is that adequate elaboration for Michael at the moment? Otherwise, it'll turn into another lecture. You don't want that.
I think so. Michael can ask a follow-up question if he likes later on. Anybody else want to ask Tom a question?
I've got a question, Gord.
Go ahead, David. David Lay from Geography.
And Tom, thank you very much for, once again, being so generous with your time with us.
Yeah.
We appreciate it. Your presentation got me thinking in a somewhat different area, particularly your interest and commitment, which I would very much share, to reconciliation and identifying points of communality between art and science. Now, my strange lateral thinking, and of course that's part of creativity, took me into Christian apologetics. And the typical suspicion of emotion in especially Protestant apologetics, that emotion diverts, emotion distorts, and what we want is to think about faith in rational terms. We do not want and I mean, I think we've got to acknowledge that the Romantics, they had a point of view which actually sometimes distorted what was really there. I'm thinking of a painting of Snowdonia by a Romantic poet, where it looks as if you're in the Alps. There are these great big jagged peaks. And of course, I saw counterposed with this painting a photograph of the same scene, and you've just got these rather gentle rounded slopes. So I mean, there is an issue of distortion that I think Protestant apologetics is a little bit worried about when we engage emotion. So what would you say to us? Because I would much rather the integrated, reconciled vision than a one that is purely an exaltation of the mind and reason.
Right. Okay. So I'd say two things. First thing is that even if this were desirable, it is not possible to unpick emotion from thought. That's now there's a lovely question in the chat from Kumheng Poon, which asks about neurology. And indeed, as far as now, I mean, I didn't write about neuroscience because I couldn't find, the stuff that's going on in functional MRI is still, I don't think, sufficiently resolved or understood to really say very much. But there's some very recent data that indeed supports this, as far as we know. I mean, you never fire cognition without firing emotional centers, and this is not just left brain, right brain, because that's not what lateralization does. So even if it were possible, the point is it's not possible. If it were possible, it wouldn't be desirable. Why? Because you make this claim, or not you report this claim that that emotion distorts representation. Well, representation is perception doesn't work that way anyway. I mean, perception isn't a photograph. The reason the artist painted peaks is because that artist saw peaks. I kid you not. Our act of seeing is also creative. It's Bayesian. Our perceptive chain is not that we have brain visual centers that record photographic imprints of the world. That's simply not the way it works. I'm sure you know that perception works on a Bayesian process whereby we are interpreting our incoming signals by prior knowledge of our environment and the sort of things we like to see all the time. I mean, that is why people do not see things they don't expect to see again and again. That is why witness statements diverge. People do see different things. They perceive different things because most of you think, you know, let me just remind you of the simplest possible thing. You believe that you're currently perceiving about, I don't know, 120 degrees in front of you. You're not. You know very well that you're perceiving a tiny little spot about the size of your thumbnail, which is falling on your fovea. And the rest of your retina is far lower resolution, no color whatsoever, and is being entirely created, the rest of your scene, recreated all the time. If you still don't believe me, let me show you this. Now, I wonder if this will work over, I wonder if this will work over the internet. It might not. It might not. Oh gosh, no, okay, I won't do. No, sorry, no, I've not got it. But visual illusions, you know, visual illusions. Why do visual illusions work? Because of what I just say is true. So the point is, all perception is, if you want to call it distortion, is distortion. If you want to call it a creative act, I prefer that way. So all that this attempted evisceration of emotion will do is to create a different set of distortions. The driest Protestant theology is extremely distorted, as I'm sure you know, right? In a very particular way. One of the ways in which extremely dry Protestant theology is distorted is its appalling pneumatology, right? Really vapid theology of the Spirit. Ask yourself why that is. So, it's a great question, David. Thank you. But that pretense merely introduces a new set of distortions.
All right.
Did you have a follow-up question, or David, did you have a follow-up question?
I do just have a follow-up question. And I mean, I accept everything you've said about perception and distortion. But when we are presenting the story of Jesus to others, should we be talking of mountain pinnacles when they actually are not there? I mean, so the matter is, you know, how much distortion in the representation is acceptable once we accept, of course, that all perception is a representation. I've written about this myself, so I agree with you totally. But
well, the answer is no. I mean, I think distortion is a word here. I mean, no, there should be no distortion. But is it if you're asking me, is it appropriate to allow some emotion to emerge in a presentation of the gospel? Well, I mean, try and do it without. Just try and do it without.
I'm asking how much emotion.
Well, as much as is authentic to you. What people respond to are people, and what people respond to, and of course, people are different. Well, I would, you know, the way I think it's best to have checks and balances on this is to work as a community. You know, I turn on the taps at a moment's notice, and you know that's helpful for some people, but not. You know, I'm Roger Simpson. I'm the only when I'm preaching at St. Michael of Belfry, you know, or did, and you know, my only let off was the Roger Simpson, who's a vicar. I never saw him preach a sermon without bursting into tears. And one of the most moving moments, actually, of my sort of church, I'm sort of lay preacher in the Church of England, that we have a training. It's quite a rigid, it's part-time 3-year training course. Some of you may have done it, and it finishes with a training weekend. And to my consternation, I have to say, and I'm embarrassed to say, but I'll be honest to say, the leader of our final weekend, which involved 4 lectures, a communion service, commissioning service, was Bishop David Jenkins, former Bishop of Durham, who doesn't go down with evangelicals very well for various ways in which he was, misrepresented in the press. Anyway, we go there. But I have, in our commissioning Eucharist, when this retired bishop in his 80s, who'd been, bore the scars and bruises of what happens when you go into the public sphere with experimental theology, and he did all that. I'm sure he was wrong about many things. He started talking about the project of Jesus, and he completely melted with excitement and emotion and the Spirit. And it was authentic. So I guess what I'm saying is let's be authentic. Let's not distort by being authentically us in being witnesses to our experience, both cognitively and in action and in emotion and in life, of walking with Jesus. And when that happens, I don't think we're going to be talking about mountain peaks when they're not there.
Okay, thank you.
We could talk about that a long time.
Judy is a neuroscientist. I wonder if she has a follow-up question to that. She was Judy.
It was more a comment I wanted to make, as you saw in the chat.
And did you have?
I think we've neglected the role of affective neural systems, the emotional systems, which literally, I believe, scaffold cognitive development. And that happens both in evolutionary terms, over the course of moving from way down, fish, all the way up to mammals and then to primates. And in the development of individual children develop cognition out of these affective systems before their cortex is fully developed. So I think we've neglected emotion both in phylogeny and ontogeny.
Yeah, I of course I agree with you, but thank you so much for that. And I think you maybe saw an element of that in sort of Michael Berry's realization that the one thing emotion does is to kind of brand a memory of cognition into our neural nets. Maybe that's my amateur way of putting it. So I remember, I remember getting excited. I'm such a nerd, but I remember some of my undergraduate theoretical physics lectures getting so excited. I remember when in my first year at Cambridge, we derived, that the inverse square law of gravity gives rise to conic sections, elliptical orbits or circles or hyperbole. And it all fits into this glorious equation. It's beautiful. I just got so excited. I remember that lecture. I remember the handwriting of the lecture on the blackboard. I remember my thinking, is that really the equation for ellipse? Because it's not the one I know about. And I was, 19 at the time. And that's happened many times since. And I know that one of the reasons that I remember the cognitive mathematical reasoning was because of a concomitant emotional response. I don't know is that the sort of thing you're talking about on not the evolutionary level. Obviously, I wasn't a fish at that point. I was still me. But anyway, scaffolds. Yeah, scaffolds.
Scaffolds.
I like it.
Build up.
Yeah.
I have a question, but does somebody else want to break in at this point? Tom, I think the fundamental drive of your book and your work is that there's a common source for the imagination, whether it's imagination in science or in the arts, humanities. And I dug deep on the question of the sources of the self in our philosopher Charles Taylor. And I found that took me very deep, but I think you really are drilling down quite far in ferreting out the sources of the human imagination. I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about that, but you seem to say that they come together in some way, but I'm not articulating that well, but over to you.
That's all right, but the experimental articulation is the only way we get anywhere with this game, and the book's an act of experimental articulation, as you can read about. Another thing happened, by the way, which is that I don't know if you know a journal called the Interdisciplinary Science Reviews. It's a really interesting journal, almost unknown, but I'm on the board with it, and it's got a board of artists and scientists and philosophers also, and the editor very kindly said, we'd like to devote an issue of the Interdisciplinary Science Reviews to the Poetry, Music and Science book. And would you give a 3,000 word précis of the book? Okay. And I'll get 5 or 6, half a dozen reviews. And I think there were 7 or 8 in the end. And Steve Fuller, the philosopher, wrote one. Imprad Hubert, the Munich historian of literature, and a couple of poets wrote, "Hey, where's the poetry, McLeish?" and so hence the revised edition. And then there's this, what I write, a 10,000 words of response. Oh, and someone said, "You didn't write about artificial creativity and AI." And to which response is, "You can't write about everything, mate, but also." Some things really are completely beyond me, but that's important too. So sources of creativity, and so this debate also touches on machine intelligence and, dare I say it, machine creativity, and the sort of stuff that there's a lovely book, it's now 20 years old now, the Christian theologian IT Catherine Herzog. It's called In His Image, and she writes beautifully about the ways in which the idea of being made in the image of God have been interpreted can pattern and help us to think about the current debate about the ways in which, quotes, intelligent machines might be made in the image of the human, and what that might mean. So I'm just riffing off your question, Gordon. I'm not really answering your question. Possibly because I didn't understand it, but maybe. but I think there are always, as well as there is, you're right, there's a common source of creativity, but there are these different modes of creativity. Right. I think they are really worth exploring.
Yeah. In terms of mental health, do you think that this project, there is some discussion at UBC about how interdisciplinary engagement can improve mental health, and we've seen that mental health issues have risen to the surface during COVID. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's good. Well, it's certainly improved my mental health since I started going madly into disciplinary, largely because if you don't fancy going to a meeting in one department, you can always pretend that you're in the other one. So there are very practical ways in which interdisciplinary helps academic life enormously. No, I half jest. No, because I don't think that humans were made to be the sort of machines that do just one task. Now, working on, you know what happens with people who just work on production lines doing one thing. And I think there is a sense in which the cottage industry of seeing the world as a whole and being able to deploy our different imaginative modes is to the production line as the cottage industry of building a whole boat is to screwing the rivet that lies at the 5th plank down on the right, and doing that for 1,000 boats a day. That's a pretty extreme metaphor for disciplinary fragmentation and expertise, and people will rightly push back on me and say, look, Tom, you can't be an academic or in fact, specialization is how human beings have become successful. We specialize. It's an anthropological thing. There are hunters and sowers and cookers, and that's how we got to be civilized. Well, yeah, of course. But I'm not talking about specialization. I'm talking about sort of extreme exclusiveness that comes from being in very narrow disciplinary corridors. So by interdisciplinarity, just to go over this ground again, I don't mean, and I have never meant, that we should be Jacks and Jills of all trades, because we can't. You can't be an expert in. So take this medieval project. I'm not a humanities scholar in medieval science. Now, it turns out I do lecture now on the master's course in the York Centre for Medieval Studies, and I play a part, but it's a team role. I enjoy it very much. Yes, I have brushed up my Latin and my paleography, and yes, I have brushed up my medieval history, but enough so that I can understand and appreciate how and what my deeply expert humanities colleagues do. So what I think is healthy is if we sometimes use the metaphor of being T-shaped people, we keep our own expertise because that's what we bring to the party. But we also reach our arms out wide, and Zoom doesn't do this properly. I have to come right back on the story. But reach our arms out, which is a valency. We learn enough about our each other's disciplines to be able to hold hands, really hold hands, and dance with each other, so that we can form this team. So that's how this medieval science team works. So I promise you, we are writing commentaries on Robert Grosseteste's work that no single scholar, however erudite, could possibly hope to write. And we do that because we get right inside the mathematics of the science, of the orbits, and we get right inside the Latin, we get right inside the history, and we join the whole thing up. And you can only do that, of course, if you develop this sort of valency of understanding each other, and you can co-write together. So scientists and humanities co-write chapters, each providing their expertise, which then weave into the whole. That's hard work. It's taken us years and years and years. And about our own mental health, possibly it's driven us mad, but quite reverse. Gordon, I hope I'm going to have to go soon because it's getting a bit late here.
Okay, we'll
Is that okay?
Wrap up at this point. I think Judy just wanted to wrap up by thanking you and appreciate very much all your insights and all your responses to our questions. And I would really want to say this book is a tour de force. It's an education
Definitely
on steroids, so to speak. There's just a lot of creative insight in the poetry and music of science. So I really recommend that you follow up. You can get a copy at Regent Bookstore if you're in Vancouver, but you can also order it on Amazon. So over to you, Judy.
I want to thank you so much, Tom, for being with us today. Again, we enjoyed your last time at Trinity and at UBC so much. And you've certainly given us an enjoyable and informative and inspirational talk, and touched upon both our emotions and our cognitions. And not only that, but facilitated our further worship of the Creator. And I really want to thank you for that. And before we go, I want to remind everyone else that on January 20th, we have Paul Rowe, one of my former colleagues from Trinity Western, speaking on the appeal of Caesar, the future of Christian living in the authoritarian Middle East. And Paul is an authority on Coptic Christianity. So you will enjoy him.
Sounds great.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you so much.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
We hope you
to
come
see you
again.
all in the flesh next time.
Yes,
right?
yes, please come again.